This session is entitled Trashing the Treaties, and I think it's quite, in some ways, a rather sad session, because I remember we was talking at lunchtime, and we were thinking the treaties began in the late 1950s with parallel activities in the Soviet Union and America, where scientists wrote to their governments. In the Soviet Union, I think there was 180 nuclear physicists wrote to the Supreme Soviet, led by Andrei Sakharov, saying, we have to stop atmospheric testing because we're poisoning the planet. And similar activities happened in the United States, and they wrote to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower had to bypass the military by setting up a presidential scientific advisory panel to get round people like Livermore and Teller, who were just fanatical bomb enthusiasts. And the result was that Eisenhower and Khrushchev eventually got together. I won't get to that. And then in the early 1960s, we had the first of the partial test ban treaties. And that is 60 years ago, and we've seen 60 years of progress, which is now being reversed. And this session is very largely about that. And if I can also say is that 60 years ago, we had some confidence that our leaders were sensible people, like Kennedy and Khrushchev, and we no longer have that confidence. So what the session is going to be kicked off by Ray Street, who's going to talk about NATO. Then we have Carol, who's going to talk about the Iran nuclear agreement, and then we're going to have Rebecca Johnson, who is going to talk about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and Trump's proposed withdrawal from it.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, because I think perhaps I've travelled the furthest today to come here, because I'm from the northwest of England, and in that horrible American phrase, the belly of the beast, because you heard Anne Felton this morning talking about the problems with British aerospace, and we are that right there in the northwest of England. And I would add that she also said one of the problems is that it's one of the last remaining manufacturing industries, certainly it is in the northwest. And it's not only that, you see, they pay high salaries. You would be surprised to know that in North Lancashire house prices are very high. And that's because of British aerospace. It's really bizarre, isn't it? That's what it does. And so, but we are concentrating there in campaigning very strongly for defence diversification and the establishment of a defence diversification agency. And I think we are gradually getting through, and certainly Greater Manchester CND has been organising events around that. But now to turn to NATO. Since the time it was formed in 1949, NATO has been an extension of US military power and in turn US economic power. In 1968, Bertrand Russell was saying, there is a danger that those who watch with horror the barbarism of the United States in Vietnam and the nauseous opportunism of Wilson and George Brown may feel that this something is nevertheless remote from their lives. That is not so. We in Western Europe are the allies and hosts of that same America. As long as we are tied by treaty, we are active accomplices of war criminals. It is a sad reflection on the brutality of our times that it is necessary to argue the case for an absolute dissociation from aggression, indiscriminate slaughter, and experimental warfare, nuclear weapons. Only 20 years ago, we hanged men at Nuremberg for such crimes. Today, our government applauds them. Russell went on to say, it is clear that it is not the United Nations, but NATO, which determines and dominates the foreign policy of Britain and of all the junior members of the American alliance. At the time, in '69, there might have been an opportunity under Article 13 of the treaty to opt out. Russell knew that was very unlikely under the Wilson government, but as he said, Britain would have lost the opportunity to have an independent foreign policy for a further decade or two. How right he was then, and not just 2 decades, but 4 decades and counting. Nowhere is that more evident than in the case of nuclear weapons. From its beginning, NATO has held a policy of using nuclear weapons. It stated as recently as the 1999 review that nuclear weapons bring peace. Furthermore, NATO, incredibly, holds a policy of using nuclear weapons first. Could you excuse me for 1 minute? It's my problem. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Modern technology. Furthermore, NATO incredibly holds a policy of using nuclear weapons first. So the UK government kowtows to these policies and also still holds a policy little known among the general population of first use of nuclear weapons. The NATO leaders apparently believed and still do in the myth of nuclear deterrence. However, it can be clearly seen over the years that nuclear weapons have never deterred conflict or violence. Indeed, at the present time, the main threats to security in the UK, analysed by the government, are cyber security and terrorists. When asked in Parliament about first use in 1995, Jeff Hoon, the then Minister for Defence, replied, "We hold a policy of first use because of our obligations to NATO." So the subservience to NATO continues, and NATO continues to support nuclear weapons. In 2014, a group of non-government organisations, frustrated at the Conference on Disarmament at the United Nations, formed the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. NATO refused to take part in the negotiations and advised its member states not to take part. Thus, the UK took no part. The US nuclear weapons, which are deployed by NATO, are vast. In Europe, both France and the UK have nuclear weapons. The UK, well, in reality, the USA, have the fleet of 4 Trident nuclear-armed submarines, and they're integrated into NATO. And there's always one at sea, and it could be, as we speak, under the South China Seas. The USA has 13 Trident submarines, 9 of which are now based, this is important, on the west coast of the USA in Bangor, Washington State. And why? Because that's facing out China. In a further extension of its nuclear policies, nuclear sharing, NATO has 6 bases in 5 countries across Europe: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, where the B-61 nuclear bombs and the US F-35 planes are deployed, in effect making those states nuclear armed. Of the 3 nuclear weapon states in NATO, France, the UK and the USA, only the USA has provided weapons for nuclear sharing. The United States Air Force guards the weapons on those bases, but in the event of war, the bombs are to be put on the host country's warplanes. So therefore, the pilots have to be trained to operate the nuclear-armed planes and be ready to use the bombs. This military alliance keeps on growing and growing. When the Warsaw Pact crumbled, heralding the end of the Cold War, some misguided optimists believe this was also be the end of NATO. NATO has grown, and it now comprises 29 states. Montenegro joined in 2017. In all, NATO's total defence, so-called, spending comprises 70% of the global total. No NATO military budget is absolutely obscene when we remember the poverty and the suffering of the poorest in the world. In 2018, it was $1.55 billion, not million, billion. NATO's war preparations grow in other ways too. Reports from the Nordic countries state that they are being rearmed under the leadership of NATO. 2 new command centres are to be established there, an Atlantic Centre and a logistics centre, so that NATO can move its forces freely across Europe. The first steps to establish permanent military bases in Norway have been taken. The first nuclear-capable F-35 fighters have arrived in Norway, and there will also be F-35s in Denmark. Clearly, all these military developments in the Nordic countries are aimed at Russia. The standoff between Russia and NATO has become increasingly tense. Indeed, many commentators refer to a new Cold War. What is urgently needed with regard to these border areas, and I'm sure you would agree, is a de-escalation of military activity, including a withdrawal of non-national troops from the member states and a removal of the anti-missile systems. NATO's been developing anti-missile so-called defence systems across Europe, which it claims will provide a coherent defence system to protect all NATO European populations. The bases for these are in Poland and Romania. The Russians, of course, say these bases are a threat to them. They also say that the systems violate the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed by Gorbachev and Reagan, and you'll hear more about that shortly from Rebecca. And this is because those bases provide platforms which could be used by cruise missiles. Many of you will remember demonstrating against those years ago. And this is vigorously, of course, denied by NATO. Oh, no, they're just there for defence. And not content with the land-based anti-missile systems, NATO is also developing the Aegis ballistic missile system defence on ships. Many commentators, not only in Russia, but in Western Europe, would call these offensive, not defensive systems. Now, President Trump is threatening to tear up the INF Treaty. It's a dangerously provocative action. NATO now represents a global threat. Once it was a military alliance which supposedly had a geographical area. Think of the name, North Atlantic. But they haven't much knowledge of geography in America, because now its tentacles spread across the world with agreements with states which encircle Russia, right round Russia, and, just as importantly, round China. And just to refer to things that were spoken about this morning, NATO does exercises in the Mediterranean, by the way, not North Atlantic, with Israel, the state of Israel. They're very closely tied to the state of Israel. The recent link with Colombia in South America reveals the ruthless expansion of NATO. In 1967, the Treaty of Tlatelolco was signed by 33 parties in Mexico City. That was the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. Under the treaty, the states parties agreed, and this was such a positive, to keep the region free of nuclear weapons. 50 years along comes NATO with a nuclear arms policy, not only of retaining nuclear weapons, but of using them. And now we have the era of President Trump. And when he declared in 2016 NATO was obsolete, some people imagined he might be moving to break up NATO. And even if it had been true, he wouldn't have intended to reduce arms, development of weapons of mass destruction, militarism, or US foreign military bases. That wasn't the case at all. He just wanted more money for NATO. Trump's uncontrolled and unthought out statements, usually via Twitter, disturb not only people working for peace outside the USA, but those inside the USA. And one senator there has condemned him terribly because he says he might do anything about nuclear weapons. I think we'd all agree that. You know, he's so uncontrolled, isn't he? You never know what he's going to do or what he'd say he'd use them. He said, why couldn't we use them? So I just want to end with saying something from the USA, because we thought about that this morning. And our friends at Ground Zero for Nonviolent Action, based in Bangor, which is a Trident home port on the west coast, of course, they've moved so many of their weapons to the west coast because of China. 2019 will be the year of the treaties and of our work together to protect and strengthen those treaties. We must not lose ground on the good work done. We need to protect existing nuclear weapons treaties such as the INF Treaty and New START, and see that the recently passed Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes into force, and that the nuclear weapon states and those under the umbrella come to their senses and embrace it. And the latter applies to NATO. We need here in the UK to campaign vigorously against NATO and its nuclear armament policies and the influence of the USA led by President Trump. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. Next up, we've got Carol Turner, who's going to be talking about the Iran nuclear agreement.
I want to talk about the Iran nuclear agreement, which the United States unilaterally withdrew from on the 5th of May last year. In some senses, it's becoming a forgotten issue. The potential withdrawal from the INF Treaty has sort of hit the agenda. And I think the imposition of sanctions is suggesting to people that the game's up and there's nothing that can be done. I don't think we should take that attitude. I think the withdrawal is a clear demonstration of the United States' double standards on nuclear weapons, and I want to make a comparison at the end if I've got time. And I think it also indicates a shift in policy which has taken place with the Trump administration, a shift in policy on the Middle East. In my opinion, what it represents is moving away from being focused primarily on Syria and turning attention to Iran, which the United States and its allies in the Middle East traditionally regard as its main regional competitor. But let's have a look first at what the Iran nuclear deal was actually about and what Trump says he wants to replace it with. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed in July 2005 between Iran, the 5 members of the UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members, Russia, China, US, Britain, France, and signed by Germany. And it was a straightforward arms control deal, a very successful one. In return for lifting sanctions against Iran, severe restrictions were placed on its ability to develop a nuclear weapons program. Iran agreed to restrict uranium enrichment, limit the number and types of centrifuges it had in operation, substantially reduce the size of its uranium stockpiles, to render the Arak heavy water plant inoperable, a type of nuclear power plant that's capable of generating a byproduct which is used in weapons-grade plutonium, and also to permit wide-ranging inspections to ensure that it was doing that, carried out by the UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, sorry for slipping up over that, the IAEA. There was widespread opposition to the US unilateral withdrawal by all the other signatories. Technically speaking, it's a multilateral agreement and it remains in force despite the United States withdrawal. But of course, people are extremely concerned that it might be formally in law, but it's ineffective because of the role of the United States. All the other signatories condemned Trump's action. Britain's then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said the UK, I'm quoting, remains strongly committed to the agreement. And when the first tranche of sanctions came into effect on the 5th of August, his successor, Jeremy Hunt, signed a joint statement with other EU ministers promising to bring into European law legal action to protect companies from the effects of sanctions. The EU has introduced that legislation to limit the damage to European companies conducting legitimate business with Iran, but the indications are that sanctions are taking their toll on European companies. British Airways and France have stopped flights to Iran. Daimler's no longer producing cars there, and so on and so forth. Russia and China also opposed the withdrawal. Both governments issued statements to the effect that they didn't accept the legality of the unilateral withdrawal by the United States, and they intended to continue legitimate business with Iran. It seems to me likely that while sanctions will have some impact, already are having some impact, on the European Union, they will be less effective across Asia. Okay, so that's the current situation. But if the Iran deal was as good as I say it was, and it sounds from my summary, why does the United States want to withdraw from it? Trump gave the reason that it doesn't go far enough. He argues that imposing sanctions will force Iran to give up any nuclear ambitions, and it will further, this is the really dangerous thing in my opinion, it will further constrain Iran's ambitions in the region. Let's have a look at what that means. It was spelled out about a week after America withdrew from the agreement. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spelled out exactly what the intention was in a speech he made to the Heritage Foundation. The Trump administration, he said, is only prepared to end sanctions against Iran if the following conditions were agreed to. And this is, what I'm giving you now is more or less a quote from his speech, slightly shortened. Iran has to permanently and verifiably abandon in perpetuity any military dimensions of its nuclear program. It has to stop enrichment and never pursue plutonium reprocessing. It has to provide the IAEA with unqualified access to all sites throughout the entire country. And it has to halt development of nuclear-capable ballistic missile system. But Trump's demands don't stop there. Pompeo went on to set a wider series of conditions for removing sanctions. He said Iran must also withdraw all forces under Iranian command throughout the entirety of Syria, permit the disarming, demobilisation and reintegration of Shia militias in Iraq, end support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Israel and the occupied territories, and the Houthi in Yemen. Iran must stop attacking Israel, stop firing missiles into Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It must put an end to interference in international shipping and any destructive cyber attacks. And it must release all detained US citizens and those of US allies and partners. Now, most of us in this room, if not all of us, would be happy to see an end to armed conflicts in the Middle East. They are the scourge of the region today. But I hope we would also recognise that a stable and lasting peace in the Middle East can only be achieved if there is a permanent political settlement that's agreed by all the parties concerned to be just. I think, and CND thinks, that part of that would mean ridding the Middle East of nuclear weapons, and by that we mean the nuclear weapons of Israel and the United States, and making the Middle East a nuclear weapons-free zone. Is that what the United States and Trump want? No, it's not. Trump's alternative to the JCPOA is force majeure. He wants to use the United States' superior economic and military strength to impose his will and to assert United States national interests in the region. Hence, he's increasing US support for his Middle East allies, that means Israel and Saudi Arabia, who, like the United States, see Iran as the chief opponent. When Trump was elected, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was first off the stocks over to the United States, offering very big dollars, very big money in support of Trump's presidency and calling for Trump to intervene militarily against Iran. President Netanyahu called the Iran nuclear deal, and I quote, an historic mistake. And I'm going to quote exactly what he said because I think it's very interesting. It shows what they really think about Iran's ability and the speed at which it can develop nuclear weapons. Netanyahu said, even with the deal, that is the JCPOA, even with the deal in place and taking the nuclear weapon capability of Iran off the table for at least 10 to 15 years, there are still considerable destabilising activities that Iranians are pursuing in the region and that are not consistent with US or Israeli interests. And there you have it in a nutshell what Obama's Iran policy is all about. Never a word is said by the United States about Israel's nuclear weapons. Never has been admitted by Israel itself. The only reason that we in the rest of the world know about them are the heroic and brave actions of whistleblowers, of Mordecai Vanunu, who spent decades in jail as a result. So if I've got time, have I really got 2 minutes? Okay, let me just quickly make a contrast between what Trump is demanding of Iran in comparison to his own nuclear weapons policy. Catherine West touched on it this morning when she mentioned one or two issues. It's in stark contrast, as you might imagine, and it's highlighted by the National Security Strategy, which he published in December 2017, and by the Nuclear Posture Review, which Catherine mentioned, which was published in February last year. Far from exercising constraint, full steam ahead with developing and honing US nuclear weapons. And there are two new and very chilling aspects of what the policy is. The first is that the United States now says that it will consider the potential use of its nuclear weapons in, and I quote, significant non-nuclear strategic attacks. Just in case you haven't got the point, it says that it will consider using nuclear weapons in a conventional non-nuclear conflict with opponents. Be very afraid. It's also continuing a policy which has been developed by Obama and successive previous administrations, which is developing a new generation of nuclear weapons, so-called low-yield nukes, that are more accurately targetable, smaller and more accurately targeted nuclear weapons, which new technology developments provide for. Just in case you think that's a good thing rather than a bad thing, the United States atom bombs dropped in Japan in 1945 by the current standards would be regarded as low-yield nuclear weapons. They killed straight off 250,000 people, arguably more, and they all but wiped out the 2 cities that were bombed. So don't be fooled by the cockeyed terminology. To finish, I'm being blurred at by the chair, which is a very good thing to do. I just want to make a very simple point, 2 sentences. While it's right to recognise that the United States is turning its focus away from the Middle East and towards what is referred to as the Asian pivot, we've got increasing evidence of that in trade wars with China and all the rest of it, we would be mistaken if we think that there's in any sense the United States is intending to shift out of the Middle East. It's not. It's not done and dusted. Trump has changed the emphasis of the policy in the hope of achieving faster results. And in my opinion, the danger is that he creates even greater stability in that region. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Carol.